And I'll hand
Thank
it
you,
over to Kate.
Sabbath. Yeah, thanks very much. And again, thank you everyone for joining this webinar that we are doing with our pals at Climate Central. Uh, we have a long-standing, fruitful collaboration on a range of work with Climate Central over the years. So I'm really excited to be sharing some of the ways we're intersecting during what at UCS we call danger season. Next slide, please. So my name is Kate Sell, and I am the Senior Campaign Manager for Climate at UCS. And I have several colleagues who are going to be joining. Next slide, please. So I get to moderate today, and I'm joined by my UCS colleague, Christy Dahl, who's a principal climate scientist and works really closely with all of the people in the climate campaign. And delighted to have with us Dr. Andrew Pershing, who is the Vice President for Science at Climate Central. And I'm just going to take a quick moment and share some biographical information. So Christy Dahl, like I said, is our principal climate scientist, and she provides scientific direction, strategic thinking, and technical and analytic expertise for the climate team, as well as across UCS campaigns and programs. Christie's also responsible for designing, executing, and communicating scientific analyses to make climate change more tangible to the general public and to policymakers. And Christie's research focuses on the impact of climate change, particularly sea level rise and extreme heat on people and places. Much of her work involves spatial analyses and products, which reflects Christie's lifelong passion for maps. I will say that a recent citation for Christie as one of the Time Next 100 leaders on climate called her the geographer of our uncertain age. That was a lovely description of what Christy does. And then for Andy Pershing, he's VP for Science at Climate Central and leads all their climate science activity. Andy's role includes bridging primary research and media analysis to amplify critical work on climate change and climate impacts and make it accessible to audiences around the world. As the Director of Attribution Science and Climate Fingerprinting, Dr. Pershing is developing tools like the Climate Shift Index to quantify how climate change has increased the likelihood or severity of conditions in the atmosphere and ocean. He works closely with communications experts at Climate Central and partners to help the media and others incorporate this information into their content. I'm going to turn it over to Christy now, who's going to start sort of explaining how um, the work of our work on danger season and Climate Central's work on attribution science come together. Over to you, please, Christy, and thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction. And thank you all for tuning in today. It's great to see so much interest in this work. Over 175 people tuning in is really exciting. The work that UCS is doing around danger season and the collaboration that we've built with Climate Central could potentially be very powerful for your own climate advocacy in your communities or whatever places you sit. So we hope that by the end of this webinar, you'll come away first with an understanding of how climate attribution serves as a vehicle for communicating about climate risks, and second, with a couple of helpful new tools in your toolbox. Next slide, please, Kate. Thanks. So every day, every week, we are hearing about extreme weather events affecting one part of the world or another. Kate, if you could go back, please. There you go. Thank you. So all of these types of events are affecting different parts of the world in different times. We have things like extreme heat events and heat waves, extreme rainfall events or snowfall events, increasing frequency of hurricanes, rain or snow drought, tornadoes, etc. When these events are happening one right after another, it can be very difficult to keep track of how often the events are happening, whether what's happening is unusual or part of our normal day-to-day climate variability, what the connections are between different events, and whether any one event is linked to climate change. So by talking about these types of events as unnatural disasters that are part of what we call danger season, our hope is that we can be presenting a more coherent narrative to the public about the connections between extreme weather events and climate change. So how does that work? So first off, climate attribution science has grown rapidly over the last 20 years or so. And this is the branch of science that's really enabling us to better discern which trends in extreme weather, and indeed which weather events themselves, are being made more likely because of climate change. Kate, if you could advance, please. Thank you. So of the many different types of climate-related extremes that we experience, there's strong or growing evidence that trends in these type of events in orange are being influenced by fossil fuel-driven climate change. So extreme heat, very closely tied to human-caused climate change. Extreme rain or snow events, very clearly tied as well. So a couple of examples of that. Due to climate change-driven sea level rise, storm surge from hurricanes is now deeper and can reach farther into communities and cause more damage. Similarly, by increasing the prevalence of hot and dry conditions in the Western United States, climate change is fueling a part of the increase in wildfire activity we've experienced in that region over the last 40 years or so. So for these types of events, being able to quantify the human influence in what we're experiencing in our own backyards is very powerful from a communications perspective. Now, many of these types of events tend to occur during the Northern Hemisphere summer. Kate, if you could advance. Great. So all of these that are circled in red are events that are more likely to occur during the Northern Hemisphere summer between May and October, because many of them are fueled by high temperatures. For example, when it is very hot and we're in the dry season in the Western United States, that's when we tend to see amplified wildfire activity. So by bringing these together and talking about a season in which we are more likely to experience these climate-driven extremes, we're helping to connect the dots, not just between the individual events someone might be experiencing on any given day, but about all of them as a whole, as a coherent narrative that climate change is shifting the extremes that we experience from what we may have grown up with or what our parents may have grown up with. Next slide, please. So several years ago, my colleague at the Union of Concerned Scientists, Erica Spanger, coined the term danger season to refer to the summer when we're more likely to see these types of events because of climate change. And we decided to try to use it as a public engagement tool for raising awareness about the connections between extreme weather and climate change, and as a platform for encouraging action. This is just a sampling of some of the pickup that this term has gotten in the media. We have found it to be very compelling to reporters who are trying to communicate these connections between extreme weather and climate change increasingly. And we've seen great pickup from those reporters, and even sometimes it's finding its way into media articles that we haven't directly tried to weigh in on or be quoted in. Next slide, please. In terms of our engagement and trying to point people to actions they can take to address the risks they're facing, here are a few examples of what that has looked like from a social media perspective. So sometimes, like here in the upper left, we're encouraging people to sign a petition, right, to tell their policymakers to act on climate issues. The next one down on the bottom left, we're encouraging an action that will help people to learn more about the climate connections that they may not be making just from observing a particular heat wave individually. Next. Sometimes we're encouraging an understanding of who is most at risk so that we can be building the case that as we adapt to climate change, we need to be prioritizing and sending resources to the communities that most need them. And then finally, we have engagements that encourage individuals and communities to be prepared for not just this season's danger season events, but those in the future as well. So we have a wealth of content that you can be drawing on if you're interested in running with this type of messaging, or if you just want to highlight the connections between extreme weather and climate change for the people in your lives, whether that is an academic community, whether that is your aunt and uncle you're visiting at the beach this summer, or whether that's students. They can be conversations you're having in person, conversations you're having online to help people understand the importance of acting on climate. So I'm going to mention two of our resources here before I turn it over to Andy. One is our blog series at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and the other is a danger season tool that updates daily. So just go back to the blog series for a moment, Kate. Thanks. We have a couple dozen blog posts at this point that are focused on danger season and the types of climate risks that we experience during that season. We have things like explainers about the connections between climate change and wildfire risk, explainers that go deep into a topic like infrastructure and how it is affected by these danger season risks. We do also try to mix in pieces that speak to this particular climate moment. For example, the one in the bottom left here, or I'm sorry, bottom right, by one of our writers, Derek Jackson, who is talking about what has happened so far this danger season and aligns that, or highlights the misalignment rather, with climate denial in certain pockets of the country. So lots of great blog posts and resources that you can come back to again and again to sort of build the case in your community for climate action. Then next. Kate, can you, there we go. We also have a website that is at dangerseason.ucsusa.org. And this is a site that updates daily. What we're doing here is ingesting extreme weather alerts from the National Weather Service and calculating the number of people in the United States who are facing those extreme weather alerts, whether they are extreme heat, wildfire risk, flooding risk, etc. We also pull together statistics about the people that are exposed, what percentage of the country that represents, how many people have been affected by extreme weather alerts since the start of this year's danger season. And then finally, the percent of extreme heat alerts this danger season with a clear climate signal. So this is where we will turn it over to Andy, because this is where our work really begins to intersect, because this information that we're gathering about the clear climate signal comes directly from Climate Central's amazing Climate Shift Index tool. So with that, Andy, I will turn it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Christy. And thanks to everybody at UCS. We really appreciate the chance to talk to you today. I've admired UCS for my whole career, and since I've come to Climate Central about 4 years ago, I think it's just been really interesting to see the ways that we can interact and collaborate. Climate Central, we're an independent nonprofit. We are focused on climate science and climate communication. We are non-advocacy, and so we really focus on trying to build different kinds of products and different kinds of material that can help people understand climate change, and especially to help the media communicate more effectively about climate change. So I want to start just quickly with a little bit of motivation. These are the maps from the Yale Climate Opinion Surveys. I think these are just a great resource for understanding the state of play that we have in the United States right now. So this first question is just how many people think global warming is happening? And it's 72%, right? This is really amazing. In a country as polarized as ours, there's 72% agreement that global warming is happening. And you don't see a lot of variation on the map. It's pretty much yellow to orange everywhere. Now, if you drill in and ask whether a more kind of policy-oriented, more political question around what Congress should do, you start to see support drop, but it's still 62%, right? Very remarkable, much higher than many other issues. And this is adults who think Congress should do more to address global warming. And then, think about, but then things start to fall off in an interesting way. So while people think climate change is happening, they disagree that humans are the cause. So it goes down to 58%. And you're starting to see some interesting geographic breakdowns here, although not always in the way you would predict. Then you get down to the number of people who have personally experienced the effect of global warming. This is very different than like the number of people who have personally experienced the effect of global warming in the United States is 100%, but 44%, only 44% of people acknowledge that. And this is where we're starting to see some of the gaps. And then one of the lowest things in the Yale survey is the percent of adults who discuss global warming at least occasionally. So we have this contrast. People are worried, they want to see something done, they're interested in it, and yet they're not talking about it. And so this underlies a lot of the strategy that Climate Central and also in collaboration with UCS is that communication is a climate solution. We have to provide resources so that people can have that conversation, because we're not having that conversation right now. Okay, well, we want to have a conversation around the connection between extreme weather and climate change, and this is where attribution comes in. So when I was coming up back in the early part of this millennium, I was taught that no single weather event can be linked to climate change. That was the dogma that we were given, and this is still in the talking points of some scientists who are out there right now. But this began to change. 20 years ago, 2004, we had the first extreme event attribution study. So this came out talking about the 2003 European heat wave, a deadly heat wave. And the study was concluded that climate change made that heat wave more severe, and it made it more likely. So you have a lot of research then that this study prompted. By 2015, World Weather Attribution, which was launched in collaboration with Climate Central and Freddie Otto in the United Kingdom, that they have taken the techniques out of the academic literature and operationalized them. So they will come in after an extreme weather event, and they will do a deep dive on exactly the role that climate change played in that event. And then in 2016, you get the seal of approval of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And the National Academy of Sciences just announced that they're going to be taking up attribution again this year, which I'm really excited about. So here we are in 2024 facing another danger season. And I think really the message is that the narrative has shifted, that climate change is an important factor in many weather events. And the question is really, can we quantify it? How can we quantify it? Right? Can we make that connection? The more we make that connection, we think the better off people will be in terms of their understanding of the issue. And we actually have research that backs that up. This is again another specific study that comes out of the group at Yale that just came out, that did a message test using the Climate Shift Index, which I'll show you what that is in just a sec. But doing extreme event attribution, actually putting a number that connects the weather event that people experience with climate change, increases beliefs that climate change is happening and is connected to the weather, increases support for federal action to protect people from climate change, and it increases their intent to talk about it. So it goes directly at a couple of those gaps that we were able to see in the Yale maps. Okay, so what can we attribute? Well, some things are easy and some things are hard. I'm going to start at the top here with trends. This comes from the latest IPCC report. So these are talking about global patterns. So can we make the connection between rising temperatures around the world or increases in heat waves around the world and climate change? Absolutely. At the global level, super strong, goes almost 100%. Hurricanes, there are certain things about rapid intensification and the strength of hurricanes at a global level, very strong evidence. And things start to fall off if you move into more complex events. Extreme rainfall is a little bit harder. and wildfire, it's a little bit harder still. But now if we go to specific events, so think about an event that might take place over a day to 3 or 4 days, then you start to see this interesting spread. Heat remains relatively easy. Hurricanes are harder, but not impossible. And there's really great work being done on hurricanes, but it's harder to do. It requires more sophisticated modeling right now. Precipitation gets even harder because of some of the data challenges around rainfall. And then wildfires are kind of at the bottom there. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means that it's hard. The reason wildfires are hard is because you have to have 3 weather conditions coming together. It has to be hot, it has to be dry, it has to be windy. And then you have to have something to burn, and then you have to have something that starts the fire. And so there's just a lot more complexity in those events than you get with something like a heat wave. Okay, but I'm going to talk about heat wave because that's where the climate shift index comes in. The climate shift index, right now we're presenting this as a series of maps that you can access every day. And so this is the map for today. You can see the maps at csi.climatecentral.org. This is the map of the temperature anomaly. So the pink and red colors are showing you where it's warmer than normal, where normal is defined relative to the last 30 years. And the blue is where it's cooler than normal this time of year. So it's not hot everywhere all the time, but there's a lot of warm right now in North America. And so then we come in with the climate shift index, which allows us to make a calculation of how much more, or in some cases, less likely those particular temperatures are due to climate change. So these areas in dark red, like in New Mexico, like in Virginia, in Florida, and up in British Columbia, that's the maximum on our scale. So those are temperatures that are 5 times or more likely because of climate change. And then you see just how much of the country is experiencing not just heat, but heat that we can quantitatively connect to climate change, that climate change is made 1.5 or 2 or 3 or 4 times more likely. So heat is relatively easy, and we are also expanding our heat-related work. We're going to be rolling out in just slightly less than a month, in mid-August. We're going to roll out an ocean temperature attribution tool. I'm an oceanographer. I love everything that lives in the ocean, but we developed this tool so that we could talk about hurricanes because they're such a salient weather event for people, especially people in the United States, even if you live outside of the immediate impact areas. So the way this will work is we will be able to show you a map like this, which is the track line of Hurricane Ian overlaid with a sea surface temperature anomaly. So you see that the water in 2022, when Ian went through Florida, was anomalously warm. And if we add the climate shift index calculations on top of it, you see that climate change was altering those temperatures. It was making those warm temperatures more likely all across the track line. Those blue boxes are where the hurricane underwent rapid intensification, which has been one of the most strongly linked aspects of hurricanes back to climate change. And we were able to say, and the scale is a little funky here, but those red and yellow colors mean that those temperatures were 100 times more likely because of climate change. We really are seeing an altered ocean environment that is fueling these more powerful storms, and this provides another way of making that climate link to the storms. So in addition to this work, we're producing alerts, we're producing reports. A couple of the reports that we're working on right now are related to some health impacts. We have an indicator in the Lancet Countdown that's coming out this fall. We're doing some work on heat related to gun violence in the United States. And we also think that this service provides a way of getting at some more complicated weather events like extreme storms. So if you'd like to learn more about the Climate Shift Index, please visit our website. So csi.climatecentral.org, you can find the map, and there are also links to explainers for exactly how it works. We also have a real-time climate alert service that is free. You can sign up for it. You enter your location, and we will send you a message when climate-driven heat is likely to occur in your location, as well as other kinds of climate information. And then my colleague Bernadette Wertz-Plackey is joining on the call. She runs our Climate Matters program, which is, I think, just an incredible resource. We produce a weekly bulletin that has on each week it's a different topic with localized graphics that help people tell the climate change story where they live. And that's my email at the bottom. And I believe I'm turning things back over to Kate.
Yes, thank you so much. Really appreciate your presentation and the work of you, Andy and Bernadette, and all of our colleagues at Climate Central. Shabbat, if you'd be so kind as to put my slides back up, because we're already getting some really great questions about in the chat about, okay, so this is important. What do we do? And that is a question that I would love to get and to answer. If you'd go forward a couple to this back one from there, if you would. I think, assuming that it saved. Okay, it didn't. I was going to show a picture that I particularly love from a colleague, which says, if you could just hold on just 1 second for me, Shabbat. The first rule of climate change is you have to talk about climate change. And I really appreciated the person in the chat who said, how come we don't just say human caused climate change? And I think I was sort of in assuming an inside baseball, effective messenger group already, but I really appreciate that point. And I think that hammering it home is really important. So I just want to talk about some of the key messages when we talk about climate change. These are ones that have been pulled on, that we've seen be effective, and that people really need to see fully. So first of all, climate change, it's real. It's happening now. It's us. It's human caused. And yes, we're sure. And scientists agree they're sure. The idea that there's not a scientific consensus on this is a disinformer talking point. But yes, there is a strong scientific consensus. And yes, it's bad. It's dangerous. And it's not too late. There's still an awful lot that we can and must do. So I just want to say the first two messages, it's real and happening now. Those are the key messages of dangerous season. It's real, it's happening now, it's not far away and somewhere else. It's here and putting people at risk. And then I think I love climate shift index because it's us. And yes, we're sure. We're so sure that we can talk about specific impacts at specific times. And then next, if you put the two together, that's how we know it's bad. If you put danger season and the climate shift index together, you can see how much climate change is driving that risk. And then let's think about, all right, it's not too late is a crucial message to help us overcome that feeling that we can have of just being overwhelmed or grieving when we understand the reality of climate change. Next slide, please. So if you put danger season and CSI together, you've got urgency, you've got understanding, but now what you need is action. And there's so much that we can do. Next slide, please. The first thing is it's important to know that on a range of issues, our choices still matter. If we reduce global warming pollution now, Christie's work on a different work has shown that we will have some temperature increase for the next 25 years or so, but it will level off and we can avoid a lot of the really extreme heat that we might otherwise see in this country. So next couple, so that's the first one. And another is we've got to adapt. We've got to prepare for the impacts that we're already experiencing and the ones that we should expect. A lot of our world is built for a pre-industrial temperature and climate, and we are no longer there. And so we need to build for what we have, what we see. And I'm not just talking about physical buildings, I'm talking about building systems, building communities that can support people in their resistance. And I'm talking about nature-based solutions too for adaptation, ways that we can hold or store carbon or provide places for stormwater to go. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of things that we can do to get ourselves ready. And then the last piece, I think, is we need to hold fossil fuel companies accountable. And we have a campaign that we work closely with at UCS that does exactly this, the Climate Accountability Campaign. So in fact, the Climate and Energy program at UCS, there's 3 campaigns and each of us has one of these things as a main goal. Our energy campaign is all in on reducing global warming pollution from the energy sector. The campaign that Christy and I work on is all about building our resilience to the impacts that we know we are and will experience. And then the accountability campaign is on the case of the fossil fuel companies. And when I say on the case, I sometimes mean literally in that they have a science hub for climate litigation, which is bringing this kind of attribution science and another kind that Christy could describe in our question and answer session, attribution science to the question of how do we hold fossil fuel companies accountable, not just for the fraud that they've perpetrated, but also for the damages that they've caused. Next slide, please. Maybe that's my last slide. It is. I just want to again thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to the speakers for being here. And we can sort of just open it up for questions. There's a bunch in the chat. I'm going to ask Christy and Andy to jump in with the questions that are most directly related, and Shabbat's going to kind of lob the ball your way. Okay.
All right. So Michael asks or says blizzards are harder to tie to harder yet to tie to warming. What are analyses for quote lake effect? I live west of Lake Erie and strongly suspect that blizzards are worse in terms of snowfall now than for example in the 70s.
I mean, there are a couple of things going on there. Most likely, when you're talking lake effect, the big climate effect is just the change in the temperature of the lakes. So just how much heat content there is in the lakes. So the lakes are really, really warm right now. And so that, that's going to continue on later into the year. And so if you have really warm lake and you have a cold air outbreak, you're going to get big snow. And I think there's also just generally with blizzards, I think the way we've tended to approach that is that a warmer atmosphere is going to hold more water, and whether it rains or snow just depends on on a few degrees. So it's really a big snow event is not evidence that that climate change isn't happening.
Thanks, Andy. We have another question here from Julie in California. I strongly believe in climate change, and it's just kind of a question about, I think, understanding how, these big heat waves can kind of come and go. They ask, we had 5 years of severe drought followed by 2 years of good rain. I'm confused about why we had no extreme heat waves last summer. It just had the longest heat wave I've ever seen in my 45 years of living here. Can La Nina or El Nino override heat waves?
Yeah, I can field that one. That's a great question. And I also live in California, so something that I'm certainly thinking about this summer too. I think one of the more challenging aspects of communicating about climate change is that there's a lot of natural year-to-year variability. So the fact that we didn't see a lot of heat waves last year, but we just have been enduring a very long extreme one here across the state the last couple of weeks. Some of that is simply natural variability. Some of what's in your question, though, does have to do with cycles of La Nina and El Nino. So typically during an El Nino event, we see wetter years in California, particularly in Southern California, not as much in Northern. And the fact that we are experiencing heat waves like much of the globe is experiencing heat waves last summer and this summer is tied to the fact that ocean temperatures have been unusually warm. Some of that is due to the El Nino event that has now ended, but has persisted in terms of some ocean warmth. But some of it is still being sorted out by scientists, why the oceans are so warm. It can't entirely be explained at this point by simply a strong El Nino event. So a lot of complex different drivers of things like drought and good rain years and bad rain years in California, hot years and cold years, and wildfire years that are extreme versus those like last year that hardly register.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I was on mute. Thank you, Christy. Albert asks, and I think this is something that a lot of people worry about, is have we not already passed a tipping point?
That is the big question, right? And I think a lot of that's sort of, I think the dark of night worry that many scientists have are these, tipping points, because we just don't, climate models are probably not going to capture them super well, because our geologic record is probably not going to capture them super well. So they in many ways, they're sort of known unknown kind of space. So that's a really tough question to ask. The one that's popping up the most is the, changes in the North Atlantic circulation, the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, and whether maybe we've started to see some kind of a tipping point there. As of right now, I mean, I think probably the best thinking is like they're out there and they're super, potentially super scary, but every 1/10 of a degree that we can shave off of the long-term warming reduces the risk of those super scary outcomes. I don't know, Christy, I'm sure you have a perspective.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a different take on this, because when I hear the words tipping point, I think tipping point for what? I mean, certainly there are these big ones like Andy mentioned of we get a shutdown in the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. That would be a huge tipping point. But there are also tipping points that can be more local or more personal. So for instance, have we passed a tipping point in being able to guarantee that our children will inherit the climate that we grew up with? That's gone. That ship has sailed, right? My kids will live in a hotter world with more climate extremes. Then there are also local tipping points. Like there was just news this week of a particular species of cactus in Florida that has gone extinct due to sea level rise. So that will have repercussions for the entire ecosystem of the region where that cactus is native. And while it's not a dramatic tipping point that's going to cause irreversible planetary scale change, it will kick off a series of consequences for that region and potentially beyond. So I try to focus less on the question of whether we've passed some massive planetary tipping point and continue to focus on what we can do to avoid tipping points at these more local scales that will help to keep people and ecosystems safe.
Thank you both. This is an interesting one. What does holding fossil fuel companies to account look like?
Yeah, that's one that I can start in on. And Kate, I see you nodding. You may want to chime in.
You
as
go
well.
ahead, Christy, please.
Okay. So holding fossil fuel companies accountable is something that communities and states in the US and around the world are trying to do through climate litigation. So bringing lawsuits against these companies and suing them either for damages related to the climate harms that they have contributed to, or related to fraudulent behavior and disinformation about the dangers associated with their products. To date, those cases are all still in the works, and we're seeing victories, but these legal processes are incredibly long. So a victory might look like a federal court deciding that a case needs to stay in the state court where it was filed. That is a victory, but it's not one that that has immediate consequences that we can point to and say these companies have been held accountable. Other ways that advocates are working for fossil fuel company accountability are around things like subsidies and the removal of subsidies for fossil fuel companies, and as well as around disclosure in shareholder filings and ensuring that they're accurately representing the harms of their products and the consequences that those could have on shareholder bottom lines. So a lot of different work there. And one thing that UCS is engaged in there is trying to encourage federal elected officials to be supportive of climate litigation and other strategies that are being used to bring these companies to account. Anything to add there, Kate?
I mean, I think you covered it really well. I did put a couple of resources in the chat for places where cases are making progress, and there is in fact a climate litigation database. I'm trying to find the link for it, and when I do, I'll toss it in the chat as well. Thanks.
Okay, so let's see here. A lot of good questions. Interesting. Kate, can you see the questions? Can I tap you for a little bit of help here? What you think might be a good next one?
Yeah, there's so much richness, and it's just, I have to say, so one of the great joys of working here is the
Absolutely.
all of the questions and ideas and work that our supporters and partners do, and that makes for a really rich conversation. Christy, I think I'm going to toss the dry lighting question to you next, please, and then we'll figure out where to go after that.
Sure, yeah, so the question for those who can't see it is, I live in California. During fire season, the most common thinking is that the fire is caused by, quote, dry lightning. Researched a lot to confirm this, but couldn't get a scientific answer. Because a lot of times when there's a wildfire, there's not a cloud in the sky, absolutely blue skies. So yes, there are fires in California and throughout the West that are sparked by dry lightning, and probably the most extreme example of this was in August of 2020 when we had a massive lightning storm in the middle of the night that lasted hours and sparked, I can't remember the number of wildfires, but several of that season's wildfires that were sparked during that event went on to become some of the largest in the state record. But more than 80% of wildfires in the US are sparked by human causes. So that's the reason why when you see a wildfire break out and there's not a cloud in the sky, it's likely due to a human cause. And that can mean someone carelessly tossing a cigarette butt into dry grasslands. But it can also mean like chains on tires sparking some of the vegetation on the side of the road. It could also be poorly maintained electrical lines, as was the case with Pacific Gas and Electric and their culpability in sparking some of the state's largest and deadliest wildfires. So that's something to really keep in mind as we think about how to address the problem of wildfires in California and beyond. There's still a lot that needs to be done to reduce those human ignitions of wildfire.
Thank you very much. We've got some additional questions. Either Andy or Christy could talk. We've got questions about the shift in both the Gulf Stream and the jet stream, and one or the both, whichever you'd like to take, but I think that's a really important question.
So I'm happy to take both, and maybe Christy can correct me when I'm wrong. By the way, I really appreciated your tipping points answer. That was just really thoughtful, and I will be stealing some of that next time I get asked that question. So when we're talking about the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic, right, that does carry heat to Northern Europe, and this is what we're talking about with the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. So the worry is that as you're melting, in particular Greenland, you're putting fresh water into the Atlantic, that it actually can slow down that circulation. And so rather than getting a lot of north-south flow, you get a lot of round and round flow in the ocean. And so that would reduce the heat that gets transported to Europe. It would disrupt weather patterns all over the Northern Hemisphere, not just in Europe. And it would probably lead to quite a bit of extra sea level rise on the west coast or in the east coast of the US. So while yes, there may be some cooling involved in some places, it would be incredibly disruptive. As far as the jet stream goes, lots of really interesting research. This is very much an active area of research. One of the things that stands out in this year's danger season is how persistent the heat is. We're getting these kind of high pressure zones that are right now set up on the west coast and the east coast of the US. They're getting locked into place. You have these sort of big waves in the jet stream. There's quite a bit of research that suggests that kind of wavy configuration, we have like big bends in the jet stream, and like kind of getting them locked into place, that is more likely in a warmer world, in particular due to the difference in the warming rate at high latitudes and in the Arctic versus low latitudes. It sort of allows the jet stream to go crazy like that.
Thank you so much. Super helpful. Christy, did you have anything you wanted to add, or should we go to another question?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to add, just sort of from a historical perspective about the change in the Gulf Stream and meridional overturning circulation. So this was something I actually worked on as a graduate student and did some climate modeling around, in part because there are times in Earth's history when there have been big pulses of fresh water from the melting of ice sheets and glaciers to the North Atlantic that then induced fairly rapid changes in that overturning circulation with consequences for climate patterns all over the globe. So just for context, that was work I was doing in the early aughts, so 20 years ago, roughly. And even at that time, there were conversations happening about, is the Gulf Stream slowing? Is the current meridional overturning circulation slowing? And I think that the tenor of those questions has changed a lot in the last 20 years. And I think we periodically see a lot of concern crop up. I think we're in one of those moments right now. But in terms of whether we have observations to be backing up our level of alarm about it right now, I'm not entirely convinced. I mean, there's new evidence. Yes, there may be a slowdown in the Gulf Stream, but I think it gets an outsized play, given that this has been a very, an active area of scientific research for decades, and scientists are still trying to sort out where we are. So, Andy, don't recommend you go back and read my dissertation, but I'll send you a paper too.
No, it's great. That's really great. Great perspective.
So I'm gonna, there's a question about how population and overpopulation may connect to climate change. And this is a question that we get fairly frequently. And it's a really nuanced answer that we usually give. So I'm gonna ask Christy to front this one for us. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. This is a complex one. And I'll refer back to what Andy was saying at the start of his presentation, which is that when he was in graduate school or when he was coming up in the sciences, we were told very explicitly that we can't attribute any one climate event to climate change. And at least in my educational upbringing, it was very commonly said that part of the cause of climate change is overpopulation. There's simply too many people on the planet. over time, we have recognized the very problematic nature of that. And it's an attitude that's pervasive in the environmental field still today. By focusing in on the number of people on the planet, we often lose sight of the fact that it is a certain segment of the global population that is really driving this change in our climate. And that is to say, it's people in developed nations like the United States and Europe, where our per capita greenhouse gas emissions are astronomically higher than they are in the countries where we're often talking about the problem of overpopulation. Often, those arguments are being made about population growth in Africa, for example, where per capita emissions are a fraction of what they are in the US. And so we'll put a link or two in the chat to some of UCS's resources around climate change and population, so you can get a sense of how the prevailing thinking is changing around that and how the narrative needs to change around it as well.
Thank you. I'm going to give the scientists just a minute of a break and take a couple myself, because there's a question about sort of what works to hold. There's a couple questions really about what works to hold fossil fuel companies accountable. And I think there's a bunch of different ways to do it. There's a few ways that we work on it. We, for example, are part of the Stop the Money pipeline, which has the best acronym, STOMP. They are directly targeting the financial institutions which fund fossil fuel expansion. And they are coordinating a summer of direct action called the Summer of Heat. And we are part of that effort in various ways. I think it's important to note that there's a lot of organizations that do a lot of work planning, organizing, coordinating direct action. There's a bunch of things that you need to do that well. And I say this as someone who has been arrested quite a few times in my life. You really need to decide what your intervention point is, what your clear message is, how you're going to uplift this in the media so you're not just another bunch of people waving signs in a street. You really need to be clear about how you're going to handle escalation and manage de-escalation, and you need to have a legal strategy that protects your people. And none of these are UCS's primary responsibility within our movement. And that's why sometimes we coordinate with folks who do this work. For example, we've supported the People's Climate March several times. We supported the Poor People's Campaign and some other direct actions, and our own staff often engage in these actions in our own capacity. But we have thought about this really carefully, and up to this point, we've not found this like the best place for us to organize. We just don't have the experience and skills that a lot of others do. But there's some questions on things like, is it helpful to just do banking boycotts? Is it helpful to do other kinds of specific individual actions? And I would say two things about that. Yes, is the short, easy answer. I don't think that there's anything that we can do or try to discourage the political and economic power and influence of the fossil fuel industry that's a waste of our energy and time. Not a single thing. And I think it's really important to remember that it is a deliberate strategy of the fossil fuel industry and their allies to put the burden on individuals for their creating a system that is deadly dangerous to all of us and to generations of every species. The phrase carbon footprint was coined by the fossil fuel industry as a way of putting that responsibility on individuals. And it's just like the tobacco industry saying, well, it's a matter of personal choice whether you decide to smoke. it's less of a matter of personal choice whether you use a car. Depending on where you live, you kind of have to in some places, but nothing that we do individual is wasted, and everything that we do together is boosted, is my short answer to that question. And then I would like, as a someone who came into the climate movement from the peace movement, to explain my thinking a little bit about that, if that's okay. I do work very closely with the Global Security Program, and we do think at UCS, which was our founding program, really, we do think a lot about climate change as a threat multiplier. We do think a lot about the military, particularly the US military, as an enormous emitter of carbon. And it's a place where there's an abundant field of research that needs to be done and that has been done, and where the actions that we as UCS can contribute to my mind, are a little bit less clear. But I will say that UCS and the climate campaign within UCS have been connected to the Back from the Brink anti-nuclear campaign. That's one thing that we can do, is to realize that climate change can increase our risk of using weapons that are way beyond the human sphere. They're cosmically damaging weapons. And I think that there's other things that we can do as well. So I just want to say, I appreciate that question. It speaks to my heart and my condition. Thank you. Where do we need to go next? Sorry, we have some questions. I'm gonna, if it's okay, I'm just gonna keep reeling through a couple more that are really more my bailiwick. UCS cannot, as a 501c3 organization, cannot take a position on political candidates. It's not allowed. We can talk about, the consequences of certain kinds of policy choices, but we cannot engage in electioneering, and therefore we do not. What should we say instead of carbon footprint? I think it's fine to say carbon footprint. The oil companies were also behind propagating the word climate change, and we use that too, as well as global warming. But I think it is important to say, if you're really concerned about reducing your carbon footprint, demand changes in the system that keeps it high. Okay. And yes, there's a rally tomorrow to stop the money. And if you're in the New York City area, encourage you to show up. I promise you that if we have a change of administration and we see the kinds of attacks on scientists, scientific integrity that we saw in a previous administration, we will be letting y'all know right up front what our plans are and how you can support them. And I'm just tired of my voice. So somebody else take another one, please. Thanks.
So let's see here. Andy and Christy, I don't know are you able to see the questions, and are there any there that are sticking out to you? I think that's an interesting question. I mean, we talked about targeting fossil fuel companies in general and holding them to account. Using our voices and advocacy. Is there any more specificity to that, of maybe different producers that are bigger culprits, or that are worth our focus?
So we have not done specific analysis around attributing different fractions of, of temperature change to different sources, whether it's countries or particular emitters. But I believe that Christy, that you all have done some of that, right?
We have, yeah. So that's a branch of climate attribution science called source attribution. And UCS has produced a number of studies that have now been able to quantify the contribution of the world's largest fossil fuel companies and cement manufacturers to things like the global temperature increase, global sea level rise, ocean acidification, and then most recently with a study last year looking at the contribution of emissions from these companies to increasing wildfire activity in the Western US and Southwestern Canada. So really fascinating work there. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the world's largest of those large fossil fuel producers have the most contribution to each of those problems. So the Exxons, the Chevrons, the Saudi Aramcos. So that's one way that we can be holding those companies accountable, is by simply accounting for their contributions. And then that research gets picked up by climate litigation experts and has fed into some of the lawsuits that are happening around the world.
I am realizing that we are over time because we have an amazing and very involved audience. But I do want to be respectful of everybody's time, the audiences, our speakers. I'm asking my colleague Shaba to put some links into the chat for various kinds of actions that you can take. Some that have to do with holding the fossil fuel industry accountable, some that have to do with supporting increased climate resilience and focusing on the communities that are often hurt first and worst. Those are working class communities, communities of color. And then the last one is sort of the first thing we must do is work to stabilize our climate as much as we can by reducing emissions. So we're going to share a bunch of links for that. You'll see that the first thing we are talking about is supporting the Asuncion Valdivia act that protects workers from heat illness. This is still a very important action for us to take. And briefly, I will say that because OSHA, the Occupation Safety and Health Administration, has just determined that they're going to formulate a rule that would protect workers, but because of a recent Supreme Court case, which undermines the ability of federal agencies to implement legislation according to their scientific and technical expertise. You may have heard from us about this overturning of what's been called Chevron deference. It is crucial that Congress pass this legislation and work with technical experts like Andy and Christy and people in the healthcare field to specify good legislation that truly fulfills the intent of Congress in protecting vulnerable outdoor workers. So it remains for me to, just say thank you all so very much for being here. A special thanks to Andy and Bernadette and Shell and the full partnership and cooperation from Climate Central that we've had in bringing this important content. An enormous thanks to everyone who joined, everyone who asked questions. Recording will be made available. I'm trying to figure out if there's a way to save the chat and save the Q&A, because there, as someone pointed out, a plethora of great information there. So we'll be working on that and doing the best we can there. But I do just want to say thank you all so very much. It's been a great pleasure to be with you. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon or evening, depending on your time zone.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Christy and Kate.
Thank you. Is there anything, any feedback for us that you or anybody else from or shall have, Andy?
I think we're still live, so let's maybe do that another time.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm not sure how to not be live. But yes, I would really value hearing from y'all. And again, thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. We'll follow up for some feedback, and we'll also make sure to send out these important links that were dropped throughout the call. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining.